April 1943. The North Atlantic heaves under a cold iron-gray sky. Wind lashes white spray across the decks of German U-boats cruising on the surface. Their diesel engines rumble in rhythm. 8 dark silhouettes cutting through the waves in tight formation. This is a wolfpack. The pride of Admiral Karl Donitz's strategy, hunting Allied convoys in the mid-ocean gap. On the bridge of the lead submarine, the convoy commander scans the horizon. The men believe they are safe here. Beyond the reach of short-range Allied aircraft, only destroyers and corvettes pose a threat. Against them, the wolfpack has teeth. But on this morning, the ocean holds a secret. High above the cloud layer, consolidated B-24 Liberators sweep the sea lanes, their long wings carrying them deep into what the Germans once called airless ocean. Each plane carries radar, depth charges, and heavy machine guns, the nemesis of submarines. Suddenly, black specks pierce the sky. Engines roar, growing louder, descending fast. The U-boats scramble. Orders are shouted, hatches slam. Some attempt to dive. Others swing their anti-aircraft guns skyward. But the aircraft are already upon them. Tracer fire rakes the decks. Explosions churn the sea. In less than 15 minutes, the wolfpack is annihilated. All 8 U-boats lost in a storm of fire and steel. For the commander, it is not just the loss of machines. It is the collapse of everything he believed was secure. But how could this moment of destruction come to pass? To understand how 8 German U-boats could be lost in just 15 minutes, we must step back into the broader struggle of the Battle of the Atlantic. When war broke out in September 1939, Adolf Hitler's Kriegsmarine was far smaller than the mighty Royal Navy. On the surface, Britain maintained superiority. But below the waves, Germany possessed a weapon capable of strangling an island nation dependent on imports, the U-boat. These submarines were the brainchild of Admiral Karl Donitz. A First World War U-boat veteran, he envisioned the use of wolfpacks, groups of submarines working together to overwhelm convoy defenses. Operating on the surface at night, they could travel faster than submerged, coordinate attacks, and scatter Allied shipping with torpedoes. It was a strategy built on surprise, discipline, and sheer aggression. The early years of the war validated Donitz's vision. In what German submariners called the first happy time of 1940-41, convoys burned across the Atlantic as U-boats prowled unopposed. Britain teetered on the edge of starvation. At its height, over 700,000 tons of Allied shipping was sunk in a single month. Each torpedo strike represented food, fuel, and weapons denied to the Allied war effort. But there was a limitation. U-boats were most vulnerable on the surface, where they needed to recharge batteries and cover long distances. While they could dive to evade detection, underwater speed was slow and endurance was short. This meant that every submarine, no matter how lethal, relied on the assumption of a safe transit zone, areas where Allied aircraft could not reach. That zone was the mid-Atlantic gap. It stretched like a lifeline across the ocean, a void beyond the reach of Britain's coastal aircraft and America's East Coast patrols. For years, this gap gave wolfpacks the freedom to assemble and strike with deadly effect. By 1942, the campaign reached its climax. As the United States entered the war, German U-boats extended their reach to the American coastline, where poorly defended shipping became easy prey. Known to U-boat crews as the second happy time, it saw tankers and merchant ships blazing within sight of American shores. German propaganda trumpeted these victories, and U-boat commanders became celebrated heroes. Yet beneath the triumph lay a dangerous arrogance. Donitz pushed more boats into the Atlantic, confident that wolfpacks could break Allied supply lines. The Kriegsmarine commissioned Type 7 and Type 9 submarines at record pace, flooding the seas with new crews. By mid-1942, nearly 300 U-boats were at sea, threatening Britain's survival. But even as the Germans tightened their grip, the Allies were preparing a response. Technology and industry, the very strengths that had doomed Germany in the First World War, were about to turn the tide again. The Allies knew that if they could close the air gap over the Atlantic, the wolfpacks would lose their sanctuary, and so the contest shifted from the torpedo tubes of submarines to the assembly lines of factories, the laboratories of engineers, and the airfields of America and Britain. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic stood at a knife's edge. Germany still held the advantage at sea, but Allied innovations were converging rapidly. The very survival of Britain and with it the possibility of launching an invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, depended on whether convoys could survive the journey. It was in this fragile balance that the events of one spring day, when a convoy commander lost all 8 of his U-boats in Night-Ost, 15 minutes when would unfold. The wolfpacks had thrived in the mid-Atlantic gap because it represented freedom. It was the one stretch of ocean too far for Allied aircraft, a sanctuary where German submarines could gather, refuel, and strike. But by late 1942, that sanctuary was vanishing. The weapon that closed the gap was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. With its immense range and over 2,000 miles, it could patrol waters that had once been beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. By early 1943, squadrons of Liberators were being deployed to Britain, Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores, pushing Allied eyes and guns deeper into the Atlantic. Yet the Liberator was more than just long wings and extra fuel tanks. It carried the cutting edge of wartime technology. On its nose and belly sat air-to-surface vessel, ASV radar, capable of detecting the periscope or conning tower of a submarine even at night. Beneath its fuselage, engineers mounted the new Lee light, a powerful searchlight that could suddenly illuminate a U-boat caught on the surface in the dark. With depth charges slung under its wings and machine guns bristling from turrets, the B-24 was a hunter built for the Atlantic battlefield. German commanders recognized the danger. But the U-boats had few effective defenses. The snorkel, which allowed submarines to run diesels while submerged, was still experimental and years from widespread use. Instead, Dönitz ordered boats to mount heavier anti-aircraft guns, hoping that U-boat crews could fight back against aircraft. Some captains even believed they could deter planes with concentrated flak fire. In practice, however, the tactic was suicidal. A surfaced submarine, even bristling with guns, remained a fragile target against an aircraft diving from the clouds at over 200 miles per hour. The Germans still trusted in wolfpack tactics. Boats operated in groups of 6 to 10, radioing one another to coordinate attacks on convoys. But the very radio signals that enabled these attacks became their undoing. Allied intelligence had grown adept at triangulating transmissions, while Bletchley Park's codebreakers steadily unraveled German naval enigma. With every intercepted message, the Allies knew not just where the wolfpacks gathered, but when they were most vulnerable. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was shifting rapidly. Allied shipyards were producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Escort carriers and long-range destroyers tightened the defenses of convoys. Air patrols extended deeper into the Atlantic. And now, with the Liberator, the last safe haven of the U-boats and the air gap was closing. It was in this context that a German convoy commander, leading 8 U-boats in the spring of 1943, prepared for what he believed would be another successful hunt. His men had trained hard, their morale bolstered by years of victories. They still imagined the Atlantic as their battlefield, where the hunter stalked helpless prey. What they could not know was that the prey was no longer defenseless. Overhead, patrolling Liberators scoured the skies with radar sweeping through the mist. What followed would not be a contest of hunter and hunted. It would be a demonstration of just how quickly the balance of power could shift when technology, intelligence, and opportunity converged. And it would be over in less time than it takes for a ship to cross the horizon. But how could this moment of destruction come to pass? The human angle, the convoy commander. The German commander leading the 8 U-boats in the spring of 1943 carried a weight far greater than the steel hulls of his submarines. He was not simply directing machines. He was responsible for nearly 400 men, each one trusting him with their lives in an unforgiving ocean. For commanders in the Kriegsmarine, the Battle of the Atlantic was a paradox. On the one hand, U-boat captains were celebrated in Germany, their portraits on propaganda posters, their names spoken with reverence by civilians who believed they were bringing Britain to its knees. On the other hand, each commander knew how precarious survival truly was. By 1943, losses were mounting. Every patrol carried a shadow of dread. The convoy commander's duty was to coordinate his wolfpack, to place his boats in ambush positions, to issue orders for synchronized night attacks, to adjust when Allied escorts turned aggressive. He relied on radio transmissions to guide his force, but each signal risked betrayal to Allied direction finding. His command was not fought in the smoke of a bridge, but in the silent airwaves that connected 8 submarines, spread across miles of Atlantic water. Every choice was a gamble. To surface at night for speed was to risk radar detection. To remain submerged during daylight was to crawl slowly, blind and vulnerable. The commander's job was to calculate risk hour by hour, wave by wave. The men trusted in his experience, his composure. Yet in April 1943, his confidence, built on years of wolfpack successes, would collide with the brutal new reality of Allied air power. When the Liberators descended, he had minutes to decide, dive and scatter or stand and fight. In those 15 minutes, every decision unraveled. His wolfpack, his men, his pride, all vanished beneath the waves. The tactical angle, the wolfpack doctrine. The wolfpack was the most feared tactic of the U-boat war. Conceived by Admiral Donitz, it transformed submarines from lone hunters into coordinated predators. Instead of one U-boat attacking a convoy, a dozen could converge at once, overwhelming escorts and sending torpedoes in from every direction. In theory, the doctrine was flawless. Submarines, operating on the surface at night, were nearly invisible. Their diesel engines gave them higher speed than when submerged. From the bridge, crews could spot the dim shapes of merchant ships silhouetted against the horizon. Once contact was made, the first U-boat would shadow the convoy, reporting its position by radio. Within hours, others would close in. When the attack was launched, chaos followed. Torpedoes slashed into tankers and freighters. Escorts charged into the dark, dropping depth charges blindly, unable to chase every contact at once. The convoy scattered, its cohesion broken, its protection thinned. For the wolfpack, it was the perfect moment to strike again. But wolfpack tactics depended on 3 assumptions: that the U-boats could remain on the surface to maneuver, that their radio signals remained hidden, and that the Atlantic air gap remained secure. By 1943, none of these assumptions held true. Radar robbed them of invisibility. Allied direction finding betrayed their radio calls, and the Liberator closed the air gap forever. The German commander leading 8 submarines believed he was operating under the old rules of the Atlantic battlefield. What he faced instead was a transformed war, one where the very tactic that had given him strength now exposed his entire force to destruction. The technological angle. The Liberator's reach. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was not a beautiful aircraft. Its fuselage was boxy, its lines ungainly compared to the elegant Spitfire or Mustang. But beauty was never its purpose. The Liberator was a machine of endurance, range, and firepower, precisely the qualities needed to close the Atlantic gap. With 4 powerful Pratt & Whitney engines, the B-24 could patrol over 2,000 miles, carrying 10.50 caliber Browning machine guns in nose, tail, and side turrets. More importantly, it could deliver up to 5,000 pounds of bombs or depth charges directly onto the thin hull of a submarine. What made it revolutionary, however, was its radar. Air-to-surface vessel radar gave aircrews eyes that pierced the night and the fog. No longer could U-boats surface under cover of darkness to recharge batteries and speed across the ocean. Even in the dead of night, the radar operator could detect the faint trace of a periscope, guiding the Liberator in silently until the lee light blazed to life, trapping the U-boat in its white glare. For German submariners, the effect was terrifying. Aircraft appeared from nowhere, dropping out of clouds or darkness, strafing decks and scattering men into the sea. What once was a sanctuary became a killing ground. In the spring of 1943, the Liberator's reach was absolute. When 8 U-boats surfaced together, they presented not a threat but a target. Against the speed and firepower of the B-24, no submarine could dive fast enough. Within minutes, entire wolf packs could be destroyed before they fired a single torpedo, and it was exactly this reality that the convoy commander confronted when the roar of engines broke the Atlantic sky. The enemy angle. The Allied air crews for the Liberator crews. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought not in the depths of the ocean, but in the vast emptiness of the skies. Their mission was simple in concept yet brutal in execution. Find the U-boats, destroy them, and protect the convoys. A single patrol could last 12 to 14 hours. Crews sat in the freezing cold of high altitude, their ears ringing with the constant drone of 4 engines, their eyes straining against the endless horizon of gray water. Fatigue was relentless. The monotony of hours without contact could be broken in an instant by a blip on the radar screen. a signal that meant a U-boat had been found. Training had drilled into them the steps of attack. Once a contact was made, the aircraft descended rapidly, engines roaring, bomb bays opening. Gunners prepared to sweep the decks while the bombardier armed depth charges. At low altitude, every maneuver carried risk. A slight miscalculation could send the heavy bomber plunging into the sea. The men knew what was at stake. Each U-boat destroyed meant hundreds of lives saved aboard Allied merchant ships. Each patrol was a race against time, fuel, and the ocean itself. And unlike the U-boat crews, who had the illusion of invisibility in the dark Atlantic, the airmen flew in constant visibility, exposed to flak and enemy fire. When 8 U-boats surfaced together, it was not an opportunity that air crews could ignore. For them, it was the moment their endless hours of patrol had prepared them for. A chance to strike a decisive blow, to erase an entire wolfpack in minutes. The moral and strategic angle, the ethics of air attacks, the sinking of U-boats from the air carried a moral dimension that haunted both sides of the Atlantic War. For German submariners, the surface of the ocean was their only refuge from the suffocating confinement below. To be attacked there, strafed by machine guns as they scrambled to man their flak cannons or leapt into the sea, felt to many like execution rather than combat. Survivors often described the horror of tracer rounds cutting across the decks, of men cut down before they could even abandon ship. Allied airmen, however, saw the fight differently. They knew that each submarine represented a direct threat to merchant sailors, men without weapons, often without escort, carrying food and fuel essential for survival. U-boats sank not warships but civilian lifelines. The orders given to air crews were clear: neutralize the enemy completely, because any hesitation might allow a submarine to dive and strike again. Strategically, the ruthlessness was unavoidable. A single spared U-boat could return to sea, torpedo a tanker, and starve Britain of oil. In this brutal logic, mercy meant weakness and weakness meant defeat. Still, the controversy lingered. Reports circulated of submariners being strafed in lifeboats or swimming in the oil-stained Atlantic, raising questions about the limits of warfare. Some Allied commanders insisted that once a U-boat was sunk, attacks should cease. Others, hardened by years of convoys ablaze, felt no such restraint. For the convoy commander, who watched all 8 of his submarines destroyed in minutes, there was no room for ethical debate. His wolfpack did not survive long enough for such questions to matter. But the moral shadow of air warfare remained a defining part of the Battle of the Atlantic. But how could this moment of destruction come to pass? The psychological angle: collapse of U-boat morale. For years, German U-boat crews had believed themselves the hunters of the Atlantic. They had been the predators striking unseen, watching convoys scatter in panic. But by 1943, that illusion was disintegrating. Every patrol brought new dangers. Radar found them at night. Escort carriers brought aircraft into waters once safe. Depth charges reigned more accurately than ever before. And now even the air gap was gone. The psychological effect on crews was devastating. Letters home, censored though they were, revealed growing despair. Men spoke of patrols where death seemed inevitable, of comrades who never returned, of the suffocating realization that survival was no longer in their hands. Reports noted that by late 1943, the average life expectancy of a U-boat crewman was barely a few months. For commanders, the pressure was unbearable. To lead a wolfpack was no longer a chance for victory, but a march into disaster. The spring 1943 strike that annihilated 8 U-boats in minutes became a symbol of that despair. The ocean that had once been their hunting ground now felt like a trap, with the sky itself closing in. Morale collapsed not in a single moment, but through accumulation of fear, of fatigue, of watching friends vanish beneath the waves. The psychological defeat was as decisive as the material one. Men who once sailed with confidence now stepped aboard knowing they might never return. The loss of 8 U-boats in 15 minutes was not just a tactical defeat. It was a shattering psychological blow, proving that the hunters had become the hunted, and that the U-boat arm was no longer invincible. The morning of April 1943 began with gray skies and rolling Atlantic swells. The 8 U-boats, spread in loose formation, were operating on the surface. Their diesels roared steadily, drawing in the cold sea air, replenishing batteries drained from hours spent submerged. For the convoy commander, it was routine. the necessary rhythm of the wolfpack's existence. Then came the faint vibration in the air. At first, the men on deck mistook it for the echo of their own engines across the waves. But within seconds, the sound deepened, multiplied, and rolled into a thunderous growl. Eyes turned skyward. Out of the low cloud banks, dark shapes emerged. Consolidated B-24 Liberators, wings spanning over 100 feet, descending in attack formation. The ocean, which moments earlier had seemed vast and empty, suddenly erupted with danger. Flugzeuge. Flugzeuge. Lookouts screamed as alarms blared across the U-boats. Orders were shouted down the hatches. Crews scrambled. Some captains ordered immediate crash dives, but the process was agonizingly slow. Men poured below deck, ballast tanks opened, the heavy hulls beginning their descent. Yet the Liberators were already swooping low. The first strafing runs tore into the decks. Twin 50 caliber machine guns thundered, stitching lines of fire across steel and flesh alike. Anti-aircraft gunners rushed to their mounts, swinging weapons skyward, but their arcs were limited. The B-24s came in fast and low, their gunners relentless. Depth charges tumbled from bomb bays, splashing into the sea with hollow echoes before detonating beneath the waves. The Atlantic convulsed with towering plumes of water, the shock waves hammering steel hulls. One submarine, caught half submerged, was lifted violently by the blasts before rolling onto its side. Men were thrown across decks, some cast into the sea, swallowed instantly by the churning waters. The commander watched in disbelief. Years of wolfpack dominance unraveled before his eyes in seconds. He barked orders into the radio, desperate to organize a defense, but static and chaos drowned him out. Each U-boat was now fighting for its own survival. Another Liberator swept across the formation, releasing a stick of depth charges with precision. A second submarine shuddered, its hull splitting open, oil gushing upward in a black stain that spread across the water. Flames soon followed as fuel ignited, casting an eerie orange glow against the morning haze. The sky was filled with the roar of engines, the scream of bullets, and the thunder of explosions. The ocean boiled with destruction. Some submarines never made it under. Their conning towers were shredded by gunfire before the hulls could slip beneath the surface. Others tried to dive, but too shallow, too slow. The depth charges found them as they descended. The air was filled with the desperate shouts of men, cut short as waves consumed them. One U-boat surfaced again briefly, crippled, its crew spilling out in a frenzy of panic. They leapt into the sea just as another strafing run raked across the deck. The aircraft did not hesitate. In the brutal arithmetic of the Atlantic, hesitation meant risk, and risk was death. Within minutes, the wolfpack was gone. 8 submarines, the pride of the German Navy, the hunters of countless convoys, lay broken on the seafloor or scattered in pieces across the waves. Oil slicks spread in great black sheets. Debris bobbed among the wreckage. And men, those who had survived the explosions, clung to rafts or floated helplessly. Tiny figures in a vast and merciless ocean. The convoy commander had lost everything. His wolfpack, once an instrument of terror, was erased in less time than it took to mount a coordinated attack. He had underestimated the reach of Allied air power. He had trusted in tactics that no longer worked. And now the price was paid not in strategy or doctrine, but in the lives of hundreds of men. Above, the Liberators circled once, confirming the kill. Their radios crackled with coded reports to command. Below, the Atlantic was silent again, save for the groan of burning oil and the cries of survivors drifting in the wreckage. In 15 minutes, the hunters had become prey. The attack was over almost as soon as it began, but the memory of it would stretch across the lifetimes of those who survived. For the Allied crews and their Liberators, the 15-minute strike represented efficiency, precision, and victory. For the Germans who endured it, it was chaos, terror, and helplessness compressed into a single quarter of an hour. Eyewitness reports from Allied airmen captured the scene vividly. Gunners recalled the silhouettes of U-boats outlined against the gray Atlantic, their conning towers stark targets as machine gun fire swept across them. Some planes came in so low that sea spray lashed against their fuselages. Pilots felt the buffeting of their own depth, charge blasts beneath them as they pulled away. One Liberator crewman wrote later that he had never seen so many submarines caught together on the surface, like a flock of birds frozen in flight. Each turn of the bomber's engines, each pass of its guns, seemed to seal the fate of another submarine below. From the German perspective, the ordeal was apocalyptic. Men diving into the sea were blinded by oil and salt water, their lungs burning as they struggled to breathe. The thunder of explosions, and so, with the human weight, the tactical miscalculation, the technological edge, the enemy's relentless skill, the moral questions, and the psychological collapse in view, we arrive at the moment itself, the climax, when the wolfpack met its sudden destruction. But how could this moment of destruction come to pass? Left ears ringing, disorienting them as they tried to find which way led to the surface. Inside the submarines, chaos was worse. Lights flickered, bulkheads buckled, water poured in. Some compartments filled so quickly that men had no chance to escape, trapped as the pressure crushed steel around them. The convoy commander, standing on the bridge of his own U-boat, could see the destruction stretching across miles of ocean. He had led his men into what was meant to be a coordinated hunt, a demonstration of wolfpack dominance. Instead, he witnessed the annihilation of his entire force. His attempts to transmit orders were met only with silence. Radios went dead one after another as his boat slipped beneath the waves. In later German naval records, the incident was described with clinical detachment, loss of 8 boats in engagement with enemy aircraft. But for those who lived through it, the reality was seared into memory. Survivors clung to debris, watching as their comrades floated lifeless beside them. The Atlantic, once their ally in stealth and concealment, now seemed a pitiless executioner. For the Allied crews, the aftermath was a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion. They had achieved in minutes what escorts sometimes failed to do in weeks of convoy defense. To destroy not just one submarine, but an entire wolfpack, was beyond even their expectations. Yet as they circled the wreckage, some airmen could not help but feel the weight of what they had done. Among the burning oil slicks and shattered steel were men, sailors no different from themselves, now reduced to struggling shapes in the sea. The orders were clear. Liberators had to return to base, fuel nearly spent after long patrols. Rescue was not their mission. Survivors of the wolfpack were left to the mercy of the ocean, a grim fate as cold water sapped strength from their bodies. Few would live to tell the tale. In tactical terms, the engagement lasted 15 minutes. In human terms, it was an eternity. Every second had carried with it a choice, a fear, a scream, a death. For the Germans, it marked the collapse of their invulnerability. For the Allies, it was proof that the tide had turned. And for the commander who had watched his wolfpack die around him, it was the end of belief. Belief in the Atlantic as a sanctuary, belief in wolfpack tactics as unbreakable, belief in the idea that Germany could strangle Britain with submarines alone. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage on for 2 more years. But from this day in 1943, its outcome was already shifting. What came next was not just the loss of boats or men, but the unraveling of a strategy that had once threatened to starve a nation. The consequences of those 15 minutes would echo across the entire course of the war. The wreckage of the wolfpack drifted slowly across the Atlantic, carried by wind and current, a grim testament to the violence that had unfolded. Oil slicks spread for miles, staining the waves with a rainbow sheen that clung to seabirds and driftwood. Charred timbers and fragments of conning towers bobbed up and down with the swell. Beneath the surface lay the broken hulks of 8 U-boats, steel coffins settling into the cold depths. For the Germans, the news of the disaster reached naval headquarters in France with devastating speed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had built his strategy around wolfpacks. Their coordinated attacks had once threatened Britain with strangulation, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. But the destruction of 8 boats in a single engagement was unprecedented. Not only was it a crippling tactical blow, it was a psychological shock to a service that had prided itself on resilience and stealth. Dönitz reportedly reacted with both fury and disbelief. In his war diary, he admitted that the enemy's air-sea cooperation had reached a level that made large wolfpack operations increasingly untenable. It was no longer possible to mass submarines without inviting catastrophe. This realization marked a turning point in German naval doctrine. The loss also struck at the morale of U-boat crews. Sailors had long accepted the dangers of the Atlantic, but wolfpacks had given them a sense of collective strength. To see an entire group wiped out in minutes destroyed that confidence. Survivors who were rescued days later by other U-boats spoke of sheer terror, of watching comrades slaughtered without the chance to fight back. Stories spread quickly through the ranks, and with them came a chilling new understanding. The ocean was no longer theirs. For the Allies, the victory was celebrated as proof that the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was turning irreversibly. Intelligence officers in London compiled the reports with satisfaction. The destruction of 8 submarines meant not only the loss of hundreds of trained sailors, but also a blow to German confidence. Churchill, who had once declared the U-boat menace as the greatest threat to Britain's survival, now saw evidence that the menace could be defeated. Newspapers in Britain and America, though constrained by censorship, hinted at a major success by Allied air patrols. The public was not told the full scale of the destruction, but morale nonetheless lifted. Convoys would sail with greater assurance, knowing that aircraft like the Liberator had become their guardians in the vast Atlantic expanse. The tactical lessons were clear. Air coverage was decisive. Where convoys once dreaded the approach of wolfpacks, now the hunters had become the hunted. Long-range aircraft equipped with radar, lee lights, and heavy ordnance had transformed the Atlantic into a battlefield where submarines could no longer surface freely. Yet the victory also carried a darker shadow. Few of the U-boat crews survived. Men left floating in the ocean had little chance of rescue, and many succumbed to exposure or drowning. Some Allied airmen, watching the figures below, expressed unease at leaving them to die, but operational priorities were merciless. Every gallon of fuel counted, every minute mattered, and rescue was not their mission. It was a harsh reality of the war at sea. In just 15 minutes, the wolfpack had ceased to exist. Its commander, once entrusted with striking terror into Allied convoys, had instead presided over one of the greatest disasters in U-boat history. His career, like the wolfpack doctrine itself, would never recover from the blow. The Atlantic, once considered Germany's hunting ground, had turned against them. The question was no longer whether the U-boat war could be sustained, but how long Germany could endure the mounting losses. The destruction of 8 submarines in a single encounter did more than shift numbers on a chart. It altered the balance of belief. Belief in German dominance at sea, belief in Allied vulnerability, and belief in the future of the war itself. The true scale of the consequences would unfold in the weeks and months to come. The sinking of 8 U-boats in just 15 minutes was not merely a tactical victory. It was a strategic rupture, one that rippled through the entire fabric of the war at sea. In the immediate weeks that followed, the loss forced the German Navy to reassess its entire Atlantic strategy. Dönitz, who had once championed massed wolfpack attacks, now recognized that Allied air patrols could detect and annihilate such gatherings before they ever reached convoys. The concentration of boats, once a strength, had become a vulnerability. From this point forward, German commanders began dispersing their submarines more widely, attempting to operate with smaller scattered groups. But the damage had already been done. The Allied advantage in radar, aircraft range, and coordination could not be undone by tactical adjustments alone. The wolfpack as a dominant idea was effectively dead. The industrial consequences were also severe. Each lost U-boat represented years of investment, skilled crews, advanced machinery, scarce resources. Replacing 8 boats and their crews was not a matter of months but years, and by 1943, Germany no longer had the time. Allied shipyards, meanwhile, were launching Liberty ships and destroyer escorts at an unstoppable pace. The arithmetic of the Atlantic was turning decisively against the Reich. For the Allies, the victory reinforced a growing sense of inevitability. Convoy commanders could see that air patrols were finally closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the deadly zone beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. With the arrival of long-range Liberators, the ocean that had once been a graveyard for merchant shipping was now becoming safer by the day. Merchant captains reported higher morale. Sailors who had once dreaded the shadow of a periscope now knew that U-boats were vulnerable. The very presence of Liberators above gave them confidence that the hunters could be hunted. Insurance rates for merchant shipping even began to reflect the changing tide, a quiet but telling economic indicator of shifting fortunes. In Germany, however, the disaster deepened a growing sense of doom among U-boat crews. Letters from sailors revealed mounting fatalism. "The sea is no longer ours," one survivor wrote home. Another admitted, "We are only waiting for our turn." Attrition was grinding them down. Faster than replacements could be trained. By late 1943, the average survival expectancy of a U-boat crewman was measured in weeks. Propaganda tried to conceal the loss, but word spread through the naval bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest. Families noticed sudden silences in correspondence. Training depots received fewer graduates. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the U-boat service, the gray wolves of the Atlantic, was shattered. For the Allied High Command, this shift carried profound implications. It meant not only safer shipping lanes but also the security needed for larger strategic operations. Supplies flowed more freely across the Atlantic, building the stockpiles that would later sustain the invasions of Italy and Normandy. Every ton of food, fuel, and ammunition that reached Britain intact was a direct consequence of victories like this one. The destruction of 8 submarines in a single action also sent a message to neutral nations. The Allies controlled the seas. Germany's bid to strangle Britain had failed. Diplomatically, it reinforced American and British credibility, demonstrating to allies and occupied peoples that the war was turning. But perhaps the most enduring aftermath lay in the psychology of the war. The wolfpack commander had seen his entire force destroyed before his eyes. Survivors of that day carried the trauma for life. For the Germans, it was the moment when hope in the Atlantic campaign began to die. For the Allies, it was the moment when confidence in ultimate victory at sea became unshakable. The Atlantic had always been a battle of endurance, shipbuilding capacity against submarine losses, merchant morale against naval terror. After those 15 minutes, endurance tilted decisively in the Allies' favor. The German Navy would continue to fight, launching new submarines, developing advanced designs like the Type WWII. But the golden age of the U-boat was gone. No matter how many new weapons they built, the memory of that wolfpack's annihilation lingered as a warning. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield of equals. From then on, it was a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The destruction of 8 U-boats in just 15 minutes was more than a battle report. It was a symbol, the end of an era in naval warfare. For 3 years, the U-boat had reigned supreme in the Atlantic. Its stealth, its endurance, and its pack tactics had nearly brought Britain to starvation. Wolfpacks had turned the sea into a hunting ground, their commanders celebrated as predators of the deep. But in that brief quarter of an hour, the illusion of invincibility shattered. Technology and coordination had caught up with them. The Allies had learned, adapted, and surpassed. The long-range Liberator was not just an aircraft. It was a turning point in the war at sea. With radar, depth charges, and endurance, it became the weapon that closed the last safe refuge for the submarines. The hunters became prey. The human cost of that transformation was immense. Hundreds of German sailors vanished beneath the waves, their lives swallowed by the Atlantic. Few names would be remembered outside their families. For them, the ocean that had once promised glory became a grave. On the Allied side, air crews returned home to applause, yet many carried with them the quiet memory of men left drowning in the water below. Victory at sea was never clean. In the larger story of the Second World War, those 15 minutes stand as a microcosm of the conflict itself. Bold strategies that had once threatened to change history, like the Wolfpack, were undone by relentless adaptation, industrial might, and the will to endure. Germany could innovate, but it could not outproduce or outlast its enemies. The Battle of the Atlantic was not decided in a single strike, but moments like this marked the irreversible shift. By 1943, Allied convoys would grow safer, supplies would flow stronger, and the bridge across the ocean would hold. That bridge would feed armies, fuel invasions, and sustain the final push into Europe. The Wolfpack commander who watched his boats vanish into the sea may never have known it. But the collapse of his formation was part of something far larger, the unraveling of Germany's hope for victory. The Atlantic, once Germany's greatest weapon, became instead the foundation of Allied strength. And from its stormy waters rose the certainty that the war could and would be won.